We're going to talk more about the Gospel of Mark. And like we introduced it last week, we're going to be talking about it as a story and using kind of literary lens, if you will, to look at it. And always feel compelled to say that just because I'm talking about it from a literary point of view does not mean that I think it's fiction, imaginative fiction that was made up. I believe it's telling true stories about Jesus. But Mark, the author, has arranged those stories to make a particular point about Jesus, to arouse a certain response in his readers or listeners to the story of Christ in order to bring us to faith in him and to align with his priorities. And so we're thinking about how is it that Mark told his story about Jesus. And this week we're going to focus on Mark as the narrator. And I'm going to refer to the narrator of the gospel through the rest of the lesson, at least today, possibly throughout the rest of the series. And I want to talk about why that would be, why we can legitimately talk about the narrator of Mark as that different than the person of Mark. And just on the top, it's because we don't really know with 100% certainty that John Mark wrote this gospel. I hope they're okay, whatever happened upstairs. Nowhere in the book itself do you find the author identified by name. And that's actually true of all the Gospels. All of the Gospels are, on their face, anonymous works. They nowhere identify who wrote the book, unlike the letters of Paul, where Paul introduces himself at the beginning of the letter, or other letters of the New Testament. The Gospels are anonymous if you just look at the gospel itself. We have early church traditions that tell us that Mark was written by John Mark, the nephew of Barnabas and the associate of Paul, and there's no reason to doubt those early church traditions. There's no other contradictory traditions that would say it was somebody else. But the gospel itself is anonymous. And so, just to be strictly adhering to the gospel alone, we would just talk about the author of the gospel, or in this case, the narrator. Another reason why we might talk about the narrator of Mark, as opposed to just talking about John Mark, even if we were 100% certain that he was the one who wrote it, he wrote it a particular way and made certain choices about how he was going to tell this story about Jesus in this particular document. He might have told the same stories about Jesus in other contexts, maybe personally, might have even written something about it, and he made different choices about how he tells the story in those cases, perhaps. But he made certain choices. All we know about Mark, or whoever wrote the gospel, is how he chose to write this version of the story when he committed this to paper. So we are going to talk about the narrator by discussing the way in which this story is told to us in the voice of Mark, or the voice of the story itself.
Well, for those of us who've been to church already, Rick said he kind of wrote it because it was supposed to be memorized.
Yeah. Well, there's every evidence that even though it was written, Mark assumed his audience would be hearing it. When later in the gospel, in the later part of the gospel, while Jesus is teaching about the end times, at one point the narrator says, "Let the reader understand." And the word for reader there is a particular kind of reader. It's somebody who reads aloud to others. So when he says, "Let the reader understand," it's a nod to the fact that he is expecting his gospel to be read aloud to others. So yes, it's to be memorized or committed to memory or read to others, to be heard. So definitely one aspect of the narrator. So we're going to talk about this. And when we talk about a narrator, there are a couple of different kinds of narrators in a literary story. When somebody's telling you a story, they can tell it one of two primary ways. One way is to describe it in the first person, that I'm doing the story, I'm telling the story, and I'm participating in the story. We get that from Ezra and Nehemiah. That's just very recent history. We talked about that. Both Ezra and Nehemiah are told from a first-person point of view. As in Ezra 8:15, Ezra says, I gathered them by the river that goes to Ahava, and we camped there for 3 days. And I looked at the people and the priests, and I found no one there from the sons of Levi. So this is Ezra speaking in the first person about the story. What's interesting is that the story of Ezra actually starts in third person, and it's not until we get to this verse where it switches to first person, and then it stays with first person through the rest of Ezra's narrative. But that's one way to tell the story. And then, of course, the other way to tell the story is third person. So we can either tell it as it's happening to me, I'm participating in the story as I tell it, or we can say it in third person, as we saw in 2 Kings 16, 7 through 9. I just picked some point of view. Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am your servant and your son. Come up and rescue me from the hand of the king of Aram and from the hand of the king of Israel who are rising up against me. Ahaz took the silver and gold found in the house of Yahweh in the treasury rooms of the palace of the king and sent him a gift to the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria listened to him, and he went up to Damascus and captured it and deported them to Kir. He also killed Rezin. Just a narrative. It's just telling you what's going on. It's just conveying the story. The person telling you the story isn't part of the story. He's separate, and he's telling you a historical event or something that happened to other people, and he's just telling you about it from a third person point of view. Now, which of these two is the Gospel of Mark told in? Can you tell me? It's in the third person. Correct.
The only reason why I say that is because we don't know who the author was. And if we would have known who the author was, I would think we would say I.
Correct. And this is another point where all four of our Gospels are in third person narrative, but we do get a kind of a hint of first person a little bit with Luke. He doesn't identify himself by name, but he makes a personal connection to Theophilus, his audience, and he talks about what he himself personally has done. I have talked to other witnesses, and I have put this together in an orderly manner. He does actually use some first-person references, even though he doesn't give himself a name. So we do have a little bit of at least at the beginning of Luke, a first-person personal connection to the writer of the story. We get none of that from Mark. He starts off with third person, jumps in, and goes from there throughout in the third person. No first person idea. Now, why would that be important? Well, as I mentioned with Ezra and Nehemiah, in a first person accounting of the story, even the narrative observations, the things that are observed about it, they can become then, it raises a question. Am I getting an objective reality comment? Or am I getting the perspective of the person telling me? Is this what the person telling the story thinks? Like when we talked about how Nehemiah talked about the enemies of the people. Is that an objective statement, or is that how Nehemiah perceived them? Did he perceive them as enemies, or were they objectively enemies? Now, we know they became enemies objectively because of their opposition. But that opposition didn't start until Nehemiah said, no, we don't need your help. So the question is this Nehemiah's opinion and perspective, or is it objective reality? And when it's a first person telling you the story, that raises the question. Now, you could ask the same question with the third person narrative, but it doesn't come to mind as readily. When somebody's just telling you a narrative in third person about what's going on, you just tend to accept what they're saying as the objective reality. This is what it was at the time, because it's not being told from a personal narrative, it's being told as an objective narrative. So we get the feeling that it's more just a statement of fact as we go through. So that's one reason why it's important to note that we have this third person telling. Now, within the third person world, there's a couple of different ways that a narrator can tell us a story. One way is with a limited omniscience. Omniscience means that the narrator knows everything that's going to go along. We're going to talk about some of the implications of having an omniscient narrator. You can have a narrator who's not omniscient. Usually the first-person narrator isn't, because the first-person narrator only tells us what he himself can observe and know. Can't tell us anything else about anybody else in the story except what he observes for himself. Omniscient, what are they doing up there? Sounds like it. An omniscient narrator can tell us anything about the story. We're going to look at how the narrator of Mark is omniscient. But an unlimited omniscience means that they're self-restricting, so that I will only tell you a part of it. And actually, I only thought about the particular example I'm going to share with you as I was kind of looking at this. If we compare this to the Gospel of John, with regard to what Judas does, Judas Iscariot. In the Gospel of John, in chapter 13, verses 27 and 30, we read, after the piece of bread that Jesus had shared with him, after Jesus shared the piece of bread, then Satan entered into Judas. So after Judas had taken the piece of bread, he went out immediately, and it was night. Judas disappears. He's gone. We don't know anything else about Judas until he shows up in the garden in chapter 18. 5 chapters later, he shows up in chapter 18, verse 3. So Judas, taking the cohort and officers, came there with lanterns and torches and weapons to the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus was. So he leaves from their dinner after eating the bread. He's just gone. We don't hear anything else about Judas while Jesus is teaching through his, the prayer, the great prayer of chapter 17, and teaching about the Spirit and all of this other stuff. Judas is just gone. And then he shows up in the garden with the cohort to arrest Jesus. Well, so if all we had was the Gospel of John, we would be completely clueless as to what Judas did in the interim. Now, here's the Gospel of Luke about Judas. Chapter 22, verses 3 through 6. And Satan entered into Judas. I think that's an interesting thing. John, the Gospel of John, often is sort of different than the rest of the Gospels, but on this point, that Satan entered into Judas, that phrase actually common to both of them. So Satan entered into Judas, the one called Iscariot, who was of the number of the 12, and he went away and discussed with the chief priests and officers of the temple guard how he could betray him to them, and they were delighted and came to an agreement with him to give him money, and he agreed and began looking for a favorable opportunity to betray him to them apart from the crowd. So this whole discussion with the priests, we find out from Luke, who has an unlimited omniscience, who can tell us about what Judas is doing even when he's not with everybody else. Whereas with the Gospel of John, he just goes off, and he's gone, until he shows up to arrest Jesus, or with the group to arrest Jesus. So that's a difference. And I don't want to suggest that John is consistently limiting his narrative. They didn't... Back in the first century when they were writing these things, they didn't have the literary categories that we do, and they weren't trying to match up with some modern philosophy of narrative theory. So John isn't consistently limited omniscience. But then this example, it just kind of shows how that would work itself out, where if the character, like Judas, if the person isn't with everybody else, we don't know what they're doing because they're just gone. But with Luke, we know what they're doing. Even when they're not with the rest of the group, we know what they're doing somewhere else.
Well, one of the things I learned this year studying John was, the fact of light and dark.
Mm-hmm.
And when they were with Jesus, they were in the light.
Mm.
And when they were away from Jesus, they were in the dark. And that's what and it was night.
Yeah.
He chose to go into the dark away from the light.
Yeah, that's true. I like that point about the nighttime there. It was literally darkness when he left Jesus.
And he chose to leave the light for the dark.
So which one of these is Mark? Is it limited or unlimited, do you think?
Unlimited.
Correct.
Oh, I 50-50 chance.
Yes, and you got the right one.
Okay.
Mark tells us about things beyond the circle of the disciples and Jesus. So we have the narrator we can pin down as a third person with unlimited omniscience. If we were going to categorize the narrator of Mark in modern literary terms, those would be the terms to describe the narrator of the Gospel of Mark. Now, what does that mean practically as we read through the Gospel? Well, it means the narrator is not bound by time. The narrator of Mark tells us that Judas Iscariot is going to betray Jesus as soon as we meet him. We know this thing about Judas instantly. We don't have a chance to form our own opinion about Judas because Mark tells us from the get-go, as soon as he mentions Judas by name, he's the one who's going to betray Jesus. So how does that influence our thinking when we read about what Judas does the rest of the time he's with Jesus? We might call it poisoning the well if this was like a logical argument, because you told us Judas is the bad guy from the beginning. So we're always thinking about Judas in the light of the betrayer as we read about what he says. Nothing that Judas says from that point forward is going to be without the coloring of this idea that he's the betrayer of Jesus. And not only does he tell us about things that are in the future to what he's narrating at the moment, he tells us about things that are in the past compared to what he's narrating at the moment. For example, in Mark chapter 6, verses 16 through 29, we get this whole description of Herod arresting John, and then Herod having a party, and how his daughter Salome comes and asks for the head of John the Baptist on a platter, and he does all that thing. John is beheaded. Well, this is all backstory. This is all actually earlier than the events that we're reading about in the narrative at that point. It's all flashback to something else that happened before the point in the story that we're reading. So Mark, the narrator of Mark, can tell us about things in the future compared to what we're reading about now, and he can tell us things in the past compared to what we're reading about now. Anything that's needed to bring light to the story and to focus our attention the way that the narrator wants our attention focused at that point. But he's not bound by time, and he's not bound by space. This goes to the whole Judas thing happening away from the group that is the focus of the story. In Mark chapter 1, verse 13, the narrator tells us about Jesus in the wilderness. He's alone. There is nobody with Jesus, and yet the narrator can tell us what's going on right there with him because he's not bound by space. He's not trying to limit himself to describing only what a certain character in the story can see. Anybody, anywhere, he can tell us about it. Well, for example, in Mark chapter 5, verse 14, when Jesus is over in the Gerasenes and he heals the demoniac, and there are some shepherds on the hill, or pig herders, not shepherds, pig herders on the hill, he describes what the herdsmen do, running into town, talking to the town about what's going on with the pigs, running off into the water. None of the disciples were with those pig herders or went with them to town when this happened, but the narrator tells us all about what's going on away from the group. And in chapter 7, verse 30, there's a Syrophoenician woman who comes and asks Jesus to heal her daughter, and they have that little dialogue about, I was sent to the lost sheep of Israel and not to the dogs. And the Syrophoenician woman says, well, even the dogs get the crumbs that's left over from the table. Jesus says, I haven't found such faith even in Israel, and heals her daughter. Well, all of that dialogue would happen along with everybody, so everybody would know it. But then the narrator describes the woman going home from that meeting and finding her daughter well and responding. So we get, again, parts of the story that happen away from the group that we would expect to know what happened.
So where's Syrophoenician?
That's from, Tyre and Sidon. Yeah. Phoenician, like the Phoenician people of the coast, and Syro is that Sidon in that area, Syro-Phoenician. Poor woman doesn't have a name, just a description.
Syria, born in Syria, Phoenicia.
Yeah. So, not bound by time. Tell us in the past things relevant to now, things in the future. Not bound by space. He can tell us about what's going on with anybody, anywhere that's relevant to the story. And he's not even bound by just observing what's on the outside, what people can see. He also knows the thoughts and feelings of the people he's telling you about. In chapter 2, verse 6, he says that the narrator tells us that some scribes were thinking to themselves that Jesus was blaspheming by claiming to forgive sins. He specifically says they were thinking this, not saying it, nothing out loud. They were just thinking it to themselves, and Mark can tell us that that's what they were thinking. In chapter 6, verse 6, the narrator tells us that Jesus is astonished at the unbelief of the people in Nazareth. Jesus' own emotional response. Nothing he said or did necessarily, but how he felt about the situation. The narrator tells us he was astonished. And in chapter 9, verse 32, the narrator tells us that the disciples were afraid to ask Jesus about his comment about being killed and rising in 3 days. So even though nobody said anything, the narrator can tell us the reason they didn't say anything is because they were afraid. So their emotional state, being afraid. So getting into the heads and hearts of the people he's telling us about shows his unlimited omniscience, because he can tell us anything about the situation. He can also fill in some background information. This is one thing that the narrator does for us. He will explain what's going on. In Mark chapter 5, verses 41 and 42, which is part of Jesus healing Jairus' daughter, and he speaks to her in Aramaic. Well, the narrator says, what that means is, little girl, get up. He translates it from Aramaic into Greek for his presumably Greek-speaking audience. And in chapter 7, verses 3 through 4, the narrator explains more details about washing rituals, washing their hands, washing utensils, why the Jews felt like this washing was so important, which was in contrast to what Jesus was doing, which was not washing as rigorously as the Jewish leaders. So it gives us the background information, and incidentally tells us about Mark's audience as well, because if he felt they needed the translation from Aramaic into Greek, what does that tell us about the audience? They probably didn't speak Aramaic, but they knew Greek. So yes, and most Jews of Jesus' day would have spoken Aramaic as their native language and Greek as their second language. So this suggests to us that Mark's audience is not Jews, but Gentiles, because most Jews, not all of them, but most Jews of the day would know Aramaic and not need a translation. So that tells us possibly or probably Mark thought his audience would primarily be Greek-speaking Gentiles who needed the translation. And that also goes to explaining the hand washing too, and the whole Jewish thing. If his audience were Jews, they wouldn't need to explain why washing your hands was so important. I kind of wish I had known about this passage in Mark 7 when I was a little kid, because then I could argue that Jesus didn't wash his hands that much. So, why are you getting on to me? And this is an interesting one that I really have to ascribe to the book I'm looking through, Mark S. Story, when it comes to this. The Gospel of Mark is interestingly secretive. There are a lot of secrets, Jesus telling people not to tell people about the miracles, or explaining things inside houses instead of out in public. There's a lot of secretiveness in the Gospel of Mark. But the narrator lets the reader in on the secret. He tells us the secret all along. And perhaps the biggest one is Mark chapter 1, verse 1, where Mark lets us in on the secret that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. From the very opening line of the gospel, the biggest surprise secret we know from line number 1. So just like knowing that Judas was the betrayer and how that's going to color our thinking about everything Judas does from that point forward, well, from line number 1, Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. So that colors our thinking, what Jesus is going to do and why he does it. Suddenly we're all oriented to looking at him and thinking about, oh, well, this is telling us something about the Messiah because Jesus is him. So we get that information. It's not till much later in the story that Peter will say, you are the Messiah, and then the secret's sort of out, at least among the disciples. And even though Jesus says, don't tell everybody else, but at least among the disciples, that's when that particular message is out, common a place among the disciples. But from the very first verse, the reader is in on it. And then chapter 3, verse 19, the narrator tells us that Jesus is going to be betrayed by Judas, one of his own disciples. And that's where Judas is introduced. So again, he lets us in on that from the beginning. As soon as we meet Judas, we know he's going to be betrayed, which also doesn't just color our thinking about Judas, but from that point on, we're thinking, is this where Judas turns him? When is Jesus going to get betrayed? Now we have that hanging over there too. Jesus is going to be betrayed? When is that going to happen? How is that going to happen? So already we're anticipating and looking for clues for when is the other shoe going to drop? And that's going to happen. In chapter 4, verses 10 and 11, we have the one example of Jesus explaining the parables to his disciples. This is actually just one of a few times where Jesus is outside telling the parable about like the sower and the seeds, or the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, or whatever. He's telling this out in the public. But then as soon as he goes inside the house, the disciples come up to him and say, could you tell us what that means? Jesus, we know there's something there, but we can't figure it out. Tell us what it means. And then Jesus lays it out in a little more, sometimes not straightforward. Sometimes he just makes it muddier, but he does give more explanation. He tries to lay it out a little better inside for his disciples. So we have the public parables and then the secret explanations that Jesus gives to his disciples, and we get in on that. As the readers of the gospel, we get to hear the explanation. So I wanted to give a quote from the book about this narrative voice from chapter 2 in the book. The narrator of Mark has one ideological point of view, that God's terms, as the narrator understands them, are good, and that human terms, that is, thinking in human terms, are bad. So thinking in God's terms is the reliable view, and thinking in human terms is the incorrect view. These 2 points of view mirror each other by contrast throughout the gospel. A good grasp of the narrator's point of view about these matters will bear much fruit for interpreting Mark's story. And then they lay out some of these specifics, and I made a slide to specifically lay out what are the godly terms and thinking that the gospel writer wants us to pick up on and emulate, and what are the human terms that we want to avoid. And one of those is faith. I mean, over and over again in the Gospel of Mark, the people of faith are complimented, admired. They even surprise Jesus with their faith on occasion. But then there are the other side, the people who have no faith and doubt and turn away, like the people of Nazareth when Jesus goes home, and it says that he wouldn't or couldn't do many miracles there because of their lack of faith. Jesus is actually surprised by both sides of this coin. He's surprised by some people's faith, like the Syrophoenician woman's faith, and he's surprised by some people's lack of faith, like his home city of Nazareth. So it's interesting there. We see a contrast of people showing courage and then people responding with fear. We see the praise of losing one's own life for the good news, for the gospel. Jesus over and over again says, if you're going to save your life, you should lose it. But on contrast to that are people who are just out to save themselves. Saving yourself, saving your own life is not the right way to go. We see God's terms being the least among the humans. By human measure, being the least of these is actually a good thing. Trying to be great among people, trying to have a high reputation and earn favor of people, that's not the good thing. That's the human thing. Serving people, good, godly. Lording it over people, bad, and the human perspective. Saving other people, trying to restore them or save them, as Jesus constantly is healing people and saving them from their sin, but also just saving them from their illness and oppression, is good, but harming others is definitely bad. Loyalty to God for the world, and being loyal first to God, but being loyal to God for the benefit of the world is good. But being loyal just to your own self or to your group, your little in-group, that's bad. Loving your neighbor, good. Just loving your own group, finding security for your own group, bad. Giving up your possessions, good. Trying to accumulate possessions and acquire the world, bad. Living in relinquishment for others and giving up things for other people. Not just giving up possessions, period, although that's also good, but giving them up specifically for the benefit of others. That's the highest praise. Whereas trying to acquire things for yourself, especially to the detriment of others, is the human thing to do and bad. So these are some of the themes that we'll see if you read through Mark. We're not going to be reading through Mark word for word ourselves, but I do hope you're reading through Mark on your own and as we follow through the sermon series. But you'll see these themes crop up over and over again in the scenes that Mark tells us about, because he wants us to really see the stark difference between them, and then he wants us to choose God's terms and follow that path, because that's Jesus' path. All right, any last thoughts before we close today? Let's close with a word of prayer. Father, we are thankful for the Gospel of Mark, that this story was told for us so that we can know Jesus better. We can hear him teach, watch him heal, and then we can follow his teaching. Help us to align with your worldview, align with the divine view of what is good and valuable in this world, and help us to reject the worldly point of view of selfishness and self-service and trying to save yourself. Help us to serve others and to give up our lives for you and for others. And thank you, Father, for Jesus, the supreme example of giving up his life and serving.